A used two-stroke outboard built in 1996 currently sells for more money than the brand new four-stroke that was supposed to replace it. That's not a typo. Commercial fishermen across Florida, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean are paying premium prices on the used market for engines that the manufacturers stopped building 2 decades ago, while ignoring the new outboards sitting on dealer lots. The reason is simple. The two-stroke outboards that vanished from American waters between 2006 and 2020 were better than anything that has been built since. And the boaters who actually know the engines have spent the last 20 years quietly proving it. 5 engines defined that era. One of them was so far ahead of its time that the rest of the marine industry has yet to build anything that replaces it. Another one was the only outboard a working commercial fisherman would trust offshore for thousands of hours without rebuilding. The story of what those engines did, why they were killed, and why their values are now climbing instead of falling is the story the marine industry would prefer you discover only after you've already paid for the replacement. Engine number 1, the Mercury Tower of Power. Mercury Marine introduced the first 6-cylinder outboard in 1956. The Mark 75 produced 60 horsepower from an inline-6 configuration that looked nothing like anything else on the water. 6 cylinders stacked vertically inside a tall cowling that gave the engine its nickname inside the racing community, the Tower of Power. The Mark 75 was the engine that pulled Mercury ahead of its competitors at a moment when the rest of the outboard industry was still building 4-cylinder powerheads that struggled to break the 100-horsepower barrier. Mercury refined the inline-6 platform for the next 3 decades. By the mid-1970s, the top of the lineup was the Mercury 1500, a 150-horsepower version of the same architecture that won offshore powerboat races throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Power was extracted through a combination of power-ported pistons, aggressive intake timing, and intake porting that allowed the engine to spin past 6,000 RPM continuously without damage. Mercury Racing built modified competition variants of the inline-6 that pushed power figures well beyond what production warranties would cover. The Tower of Power was killed by Mercury's own decision to move the top of the lineup to V6 architecture. In 1976, the company launched a 2.0-liter Black Max V6 at 175 horsepower, which immediately displaced the inline-6 as the flagship offshore engine. Mercury kept building inline-6s in lower horsepower variants until the late 1980s, when production finally ended around 1989. The last new Tower of Power came off the line that year. Vintage examples appear regularly at outboard auctions, and clear running specimens hold their value better than the Mercury V6 engines that originally replaced them. The Tower of Power was not the engine that established American marine horsepower competition. Mercury has not built another inline-6 outboard since the platform left production. Engine number 2, the Evinrude 3.6-liter V8 XP. OMC introduced the first V8 outboard in 1984. Evinrude 3.6-liter XP produced 275 horsepower from 8 cylinders arranged in a configuration that no other outboard manufacturer had attempted before, and that none would attempt again for almost 3 decades. The engine was an open deceleration that OMC intended to dominate the high horsepower offshore market through pure displacement and cylinder count. The 3.6-liter V8 had performance characteristics that the Mercury V6 engines of the same era could not match. The displacement advantage produced a torque curve that worked better at the lower RPM ranges where offshore boats actually cruised. The cylinder count gave the engine a smoothness that the V6 architectures of the time could only approximate. OMC marketed it aggressively as the engine for serious offshore performance. And for a brief window, the V8 XP was the most powerful production outboard in the world. What killed the engine was OMC itself. The company struggled through the 1990s with the Ficht direct injection failures and the broader corporate decline that ended in bankruptcy in 2000. The V8 XP went out of production years before the company collapsed, with the final units leaving the production line in the early 1990s. The engine never had a direct successor inside OMC, and the V8 outboard architecture itself disappeared from the American marine industry until Mercury revived the V8 outboard concept with the Verado V8 platform in 2018. 34 years separated the two products. The V8 XP was technically ahead of its time. OMC was not. Engine number 3, the Mercury 2.5-liter V6 Black Max. The Mercury 2.5-liter V6 Black Max replaced the Tower of Power as the company's high-horsepower platform in the mid-1980s and stayed in production through the mid-1990s. Carbureted versions came in 150, 175, 200, and eventually 225 horsepower variants. The architecture was a 60-degree V6 with a single carburetor per cylinder bank, and later EFI variants improved fuel economy without losing the power-to-weight ratio that made the platform famous. The 2.5-liter V6 mattered for one reason beyond its production figures. The Mercury Racing division built modified competition versions of this engine that became the foundation for high-performance offshore powerboat racing in the United States for over a decade. The most extreme variants used modified heads, custom ignition systems, and competition fuel mapping to extract horsepower numbers that any production engine of the same displacement would have struggled to approach. Mercury sold the 2.5-liter V6 to tuners, to commercial operators, to bass fishermen who wanted the lightest possible high-horsepower outboard, and to anyone who needed an engine that could be modified extensively without breaking the bottom end. Mercury phased out the carbureted 2.5-liter V6 in the late 1990s when the company launched the Optimax direct fuel injection two-stroke. The Optimax was supposed to be the engine that carried Mercury through the coming EPA emissions deadlines, and the 2.5 carbureted V6 was the platform it replaced. By the early 2000s, the Black Max name had been retired from active marketing. The modular tunability that made the 2.5-liter V6 a racing platform never carried over into the four-stroke replacements that followed. Engine number 4, the Yamaha OX66. The Yamaha OX66 entered production in 1996 as a V6 with electronic fuel injection, and over the next 7 years, it became the most quietly respected high-horsepower two-stroke ever built. Yamaha released the engine in 150, 175, 200, 225, and 250 horsepower configurations. The OX66 marked the moment Japanese two-stroke engineering caught up to American performance metrics, and then quietly moved past them on reliability. What made the OX66 different from anything Mercury or OMC was building at the same time was the EFI architecture. The Yamaha system delivered precise fuel metering across the engine's RPM range, which produced smoother power delivery and significantly better fuel economy than the carbureted competition. The cylinder bores were configured to handle continuous high RPM operation in saltwater applications without the failure modes that plagued the early American direct injection two-strokes. Commercial fishermen in the Bahamas, the Florida Keys, and the Caribbean adopted the OX66 in the late 1990s and continued running the same engines for the next 2 decades. Documented examples have logged over 3,000 commercial hours on the original powerhead without major rebuild work. The engine became the standard against which commercial two-stroke reliability was measured. Yamaha discontinued the OX66 in 2003 when the company pivoted its high-horsepower lineup to the F-Series 4-stroke platform that defines the brand today. The decision was driven by emissions compliance. The OX66 could not meet the EPA Tier 3 rules that took effect in the mid-2000s, and Yamaha chose to retire the engine rather than redesign it. Used OX66 examples in good running condition retain real value on the secondary market, and the engine has driven a quiet repower trend among commercial operators who would rather buy a rebuilt two-stroke than pay for a new four-stroke replacement. Engine number 5, the Mercury Optimax. The Mercury Optimax launched in 1996 as the company's direct response to the coming EPA emissions deadlines. Mercury has spent years watching the regulatory framework tighten around two-stroke outboards, and the Optimax was the engineering bet that bought the company another decade in the high-horsepower two-stroke market. The platform used a direct fuel injection system that allowed the engine to meet emission standards the carbureted 2.5-liter Black Max V6 could not approach. The Optimax architecture was different from anything Mercury had built before. The fuel injection system metered fuel directly into the combustion chamber rather than the carbureted approach that had defined Mercury two-strokes for 40 years. The result was an engine that produced fewer emissions, used less fuel, and retained the throttle response and power-to-weight ratio that made two-stroke outboards competitive against the early four-stroke alternatives. Mercury released the Optimax in horsepower variants from 75 through 250 over the platform's production run, and the engine became the company's flagship two-stroke through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The early Optimax engines had reliability problems that Mercury spent the first few years correcting. The first-generation injection systems, the air compressor components, and the electronic engine management modules all required service revisions before the platform stabilized. By the mid-2000s, the Optimax had matured into a reliable engine that commercial and recreational buyers trusted, with the 200 and 225 horsepower variants becoming particularly popular among bass tournament anglers and offshore fishermen who wanted the weight advantage of a two-stroke without the emissions penalty. Mercury wound down the Optimax over the late 2010s as the company pivoted entirely to four-stroke architectures. The Pro XS four-stroke platform absorbed most of the high horsepower applications the Optimax had served. And by the early 2020s, Mercury had stopped producing two-stroke outboards above 30 horsepower entirely. The Optimax was the last carbureted replacement two-stroke architecture Mercury would ever build. The engineering bet that bought Mercury an additional decade of two-stroke sales ended when the company decided the four-stroke transition was no longer optional. Engine number 5, the Evinrude E-TEC. The Evinrude E-TEC launched in 2004 as the last serious attempt by an American manufacturer to keep two-stroke outboards alive in a regulatory environment that was rapidly moving against the architecture. BRP, which had acquired the Evinrude and Johnson brands out of the OMC bankruptcy, invested heavily in developing a direct fuel injection system that could meet the EPA Tier 3 emission standards without the catalytic converters that four-strokes required. The E-TEC was the result. The engine met emissions, produced power-to-weight numbers that four-strokes of equivalent horsepower could not match, and required no break-in period. The E-TEC was unlike any two-stroke that came before it. The direct injection system precisely metered fuel based on real-time engine load data, which eliminated the smoke and odor that defined older two-strokes. Maintenance intervals stretched to 3 years between scheduled service visits, which was longer than any production four-stroke could match. The engine started reliably in cold weather, idled cleanly, and produced fuel economy figures within 10% of comparable four-strokes, while weighing significantly less. Commercial fleets adopted it for the weight advantage. Sport fishermen adopted it for the throttle response. Bass tournament anglers ran it because nothing else in the horsepower class could match the acceleration. The E-TEC G2 launched in 2014 as the second generation of the platform, with redesigned cowlings and updated electronics. The G2 ran into the parts and reliability problems that contributed to BRP's eventual decision to shut Evinrude down entirely in May 2020. The shutdown ended American two-stroke outboard production. The Evinrude name, which had been on outboards continuously since 1907, was retired from the market. The engineering work that produced the E-TEC direct injection system was never licensed to another manufacturer, and the technology has not appeared on any production outboard since the Evinrude facility closed. Used E-TEC engines retain real value on the secondary market among commercial and recreational buyers who ran them new. The platform was the last evidence that high-performance two-stroke outboards could be made to meet modern emission standards if a manufacturer was willing to invest in the engineering. Nobody has been willing to invest since. These 5 engines spanned 6 decades of American marine history, from the 1956 Mark 75 to the 2020 Evinrude shutdown. What they had in common was an architectural approach that prioritized power to weight, mechanical simplicity, and the kind of performance characteristics that four-stroke engineering can approximate but cannot fully replicate. EPA Tier 3 emissions rules killed most of them between 2006 and 2008. Corporate decisions killed the rest. The replacements were heavier, more complex, and more expensive to repair when they failed. What disappeared from American waters between the late 1990s and 2020 was not just a category of engine. It was an engineering philosophy that defined how Americans built and used recreational boats for half a century. The four-stroke that replaced these engines are better in measurable categories like emissions and fuel economy, and they're worse in categories like weight, throttle response, and serviceability that the market departments stopped emphasizing once the regulatory pressure made the comparison uncomfortable. The boats that carried these engines are still in service. The engines themselves are increasingly hard to find on the used market in clean running condition. The era these 5 engines defined will exist only in the maintenance logs of the boats that were lucky enough to buy them before the showrooms moved on.